My mother lifted my chair away from the Thanksgiving table like she was clearing a dirty dish. The room went quiet in that way. A room only goes quiet when everyone has agreed in advance not to see you. I stood in the doorway with my coat still over one arm and a plain white envelope in my other hand. Steam rose off the turkey, the clock over the sideboard ticked. My father looked at his plate and my sister looked at her phone and my stepmother set my chair against the far wall and said the words she had been saying to me one way or another for 28 years. But here is what none of them knew. What made my hand so steady while hers shook on the chair back. The house they were sitting in had never once belonged to them. And 3 weeks earlier I had finally found the paperwork that proved it. I was the only person at that table who had read it. To understand how I ended up standing in that doorway with an envelope on Thanksgiving, you have to go back almost 3 decades to a house that was never supposed to be hers, and a promise a dying woman made to a 6-year-old. Welcome back to Revenge Range, where the quietest person at the table is usually the one holding the truth. If buried secrets and justice that arrives on paper are your kind of story, drop a comment and subscribe. My name is Myra Frost, and I am 34 years old, or I was that autumn, with my 35th birthday, closer than I had any idea mattered. And I have spent the better part of a decade helping strangers die well. I am a hospice nurse. People hear that and tilt their heads like I just told them I diffuse bombs for a living. The truth is gentler than that. I sit with people in the last rooms of their lives. I hold hands that have stopped being able to hold back. I learned a long time ago that dignity is the one thing nobody can give you and nobody can take. Though plenty of people will try the second part. I am good at my job. I am calm under pressure. The kind of calm that makes new doctors trust me and grieving families lean on me. I can keep a steady voice while a monitor flatlines. What I could never do for most of my life was keep a steady voice in my own father's house. Funny, isn't it? I could comfort a stranger through their worst hour and then drive 25 minutes out to the farmhouse where I grew up and turn back into a ghost the second I crossed the threshold. I had a small apartment in town near the hospital with good light and a stubborn fern. That was home. The farmhouse was something else. A place I both belonged to and was never quite allowed inside of. Like a museum of a family I was technically part of and never really in. For years I told myself that was just how some families were. Some kids get the warm chair by the fire. Some kids get told kindly and constantly that they are a disappointment until they stop asking why. I had stopped asking why. Then 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving, I found a name I was never supposed to see, and the asking started all over again. The invitation came the way it always came, wrapped in conditions. Sandra called me on a Tuesday. Her voice doing that bright thing it did, the voice she used for church and for neighbors, and never once for me when no one was listening. "We're doing Thanksgiving at the house," she said. "You're welcome to come. Welcome to come. Not we want you there. Not we'd love to have you. Welcome the way you welcome a delivery driver to leave the package by the door. Just," she added, and I could hear her choosing the leash. "Don't bring any of those strange dishes you make. And please, Myra, no hospital stories at the table. Brooke's bringing the baby. It's a happy day. I said I'd think about it. I always said I'd think about it. I always said I'd think about it. And I always went because some animal part of me kept hoping that this would be the year the door actually opened. This year was different though, and not for the reason she thought. This year I had a reason of my own to sit at that table. A reason folded into an envelope in my glove box. I let her talk. She told me what time, what to wear, who not to mention. She told me my cousin from Ohio might come, and that I should be normal. When she hung up, I sat in my car in the hospital lot for a while. 28 years of being welcome to come. I thought about my mother, who I could barely remember, whose face I knew mostly from one photograph my father kept in a drawer instead of on a wall. I thought about the word I had seen. And for the first time in my life, the thought of that house did not make me feel small. It made me feel patient. I had learned patience at a lot of bedsides. I was about to learn what it was for. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road on what used to be 80 acres and was now mostly leased out to a neighbor who ran cattle. White clapboard, green roof, a porch that wrapped 2 sides. It was beautiful in the way old farmhouses are beautiful, the kind of place strangers slow down to photograph. I grew up in that house and never once felt like I lived there. My earliest memories are of being told to be careful, be quiet, be less. There was a cedar tree by the gate, and a gate post with a square patch, where the paint was always slightly newer than the rest, like a scar that kept getting touched up. When I was little, I asked my father what had been there. He said nothing, just old wood. But you don't repaint nothing. You don't keep repainting the same square foot of a gatepost for 30 years over nothing. I noticed things like that. I think I always had a nurse's eyes before I had a nurse's training. The habit of watching for the small wrong detail that the family has learned to stop seeing. The bruise under the sleeve, the patch on the gatepost, the way my father's jaw tightened whenever the conversation drifted toward the years before Sandra. There were rooms in that house I was never sent to. There was a name nobody said, and there was the house itself, which everyone treated as Sandra's domain to rule and Brooke's birthright to inherit, while I was treated as a guest who had overstayed since the age of 6. I used to think that was just the shape of grief, that my father had loved my mother so much he couldn't bear reminders, and I was the biggest reminder of all. That story let me forgive a lot. It would be a while before I learned the story was a lie and who had built it and why. My mother was a forbidden subject, and I learned the rule the way children learn all the important rules by breaking it and watching the temperature in the room drop. I was maybe 8. I asked Sandra what my mom had been like. Sandra was at the stove. She didn't turn around. She just said in a flat, final voice, "This was never your home, Myra. Don't go digging up things that aren't yours. This was never your home." I didn't understand it then. I thought she meant I didn't belong, which hurt plenty on its own. I filed it away with all the other small cruelties, and I stopped asking. Every now and then over the years, I'd try again gently, the way you test a sore tooth. Once I found a box in the attic, and Sandra took it away before I could open it. Once I asked my father on a good day what my mother's favorite season was, and he got a look on his face like a man hearing a song from a war. And Sandra came into the room and the look went away and never came back. So I learned you don't ask about Helen. You don't ask about the years before. You don't ask why the gatepost gets repainted. You keep your head down. You make good grades. You leave for nursing school the first chance you get, and you tell yourself that the reason you feel like a stranger in your own family is that you are simply fundamentally not the kind of person people keep. I believe that about myself for a long time. I want to be honest about that because I know some of you have believed it about yourselves too. It is a quiet poison. It does its work slowly, and the people who feed it to you almost never look like villains. They look like family. Passing the potatoes, telling you to be normal. There was a word for me in that family, and the word was disappointment, not shouted. Sandra was far too careful to shout. It came in the shape of comparisons mostly. Brooke got a car for her 16th birthday and a party with a tent in the yard. I got a card and a reminder not to expect too much because I was not really a celebration kind of girl. Brooke struggled through community college on the family's dime, switching majors 3 times, and that was called finding herself. I put myself through nursing school on loans and night shifts, and that was called being cold, being distant, thinking I was better than everyone. The math never worked. But the math was never the point. The point was that there had to be a disappointment in the house, and the role had been assigned to me before I was old enough to audition for it. My half-sister, Brooke, learned the language young. By the time she was a teenager, she could make me feel like an intruder with a single raised eyebrow. The only one who never quite caught the disease was my half-brother there, Danny, the youngest, 12 years behind me. When we were kids, he used to sneak the good rolls off the table and leave them outside my bedroom door wrapped in a napkin because he'd noticed I was always somehow served last and least. He never said anything about it. He was 4. He just knew, the way little kids know that something at our table was crooked. I think about those rolls more than I think about almost anything else from that house. A 4-year-old saw it. A 4-year-old tried to fix it with bread. And the grown adults who ran that family, who were supposed to protect me, looked at the same crooked table every single day and called it straight. That consistency used to confuse me. Later, I understood it. Consistency that perfect isn't an accident. It's a script. So why did I say yes this year? After all of it, 2 reasons, and only one of them was the real one. The reason I told myself was my father. 3 months earlier, Raymond had a cardiac event, a bad one. The kind that puts a 66-year-old man in a hospital bed with tubes and beeping. And a daughter, who happens to be a nurse, standing in the hallway being asked by the family to handle the medical side, because that was finally a use they had for me. I sat with him in the ICU at 2 in the morning, more than once, while Sandra slept at home and Brooke posted prayer requests online. And in those quiet hours, I let myself want something I'd given up wanting. I wanted to ask him about my mother before it was too late. I wanted one true conversation. He survived. He came home. The window I'd imagined started to close again the moment Sandra reclaimed the room. But that "I see you stay" did one other thing, the thing that became the real reason. While he was admitted, the family asked me to bring him a few items from home. Reading glasses, his wallet, some papers he kept fussing about from the nightstand. I gathered them up and tucked in with the bank statements, and the Medicare letters was an old envelope yellowed at the edges with a law firm's name printed in the corner and a typed line I read before I understood I was reading something I wasn't meant to. Refrost, Trust, Frost. That was my mother's name. My name, a name nobody in that house had said in decades. My father saw it in my hand and reached for it faster than a man 3 days out of cardiac care should be able to move. "That's old junk," he said. "Give it here." I gave it here. "But you don't lunge for junk." I'd seen a name I wasn't supposed to see and I couldn't unsee it. I'm Myra. I spend my days helping strangers say goodbye with their dignity intact. I had never once been handed any of my own. So when I saw that name on an envelope that my family had spent my whole life making sure I'd never go looking for something in me that had been asleep since I was 6 years old, sat up. If you've ever been the guest in your own family, the disappointment in someone else's story, stay with me. This is the year the paperwork caught up. Subscribe and let's keep going. The name stayed with me for days. Frost, Trust. I am not an impulsive person. In my line of work, impulsive gets people hurt. So I didn't storm back to the farmhouse demanding answers. I did what I do at the bedside when something doesn't add up. I started gathering information quietly, one careful step at a time. First, I tried the simplest, most reasonable door. I called my father a week after he was home and stable, and I asked him plainly and kindly what the Frost Trust was. There was a silence on the line, the particular silence of a man deciding which lie to use. "It's nothing, honey," he finally said. "Your mother had a little account years ago. It's long closed. Don't trouble yourself." Then, before I could ask anything else, he said he was tired and had to rest, and he hung up. A little account, long closed. I had handled enough estates in enough families to know what a trust was, and a trust is not a little account. A trust is a legal structure built to hold something valuable and to control who gets it and when. People do not build trusts for pocket change. People build trusts to protect something or someone from somebody else. My father was a bad liar, which is its own kind of information. He had loved my mother. That part I believed. A man who loved his late wife does not flinch and dodge when her name comes up on a document. He gets sad, wistful, or quiet. My father wasn't sad. My father was scared. And the only thing that turns grief into fear in my experience is guilt. I sat with that for a night, then I made a list, the way I make a list for a complicated patient. 3 names, a law firm, a county office, an old neighbor I half remembered. I didn't know yet what I was walking toward. I just knew I was finally walking. Against my better judgment, I tried Sandra next. I told myself it was due diligence. Really, I think I wanted to watch her face. We were in the farmhouse kitchen, the same kitchen where she told me this was never my home 20 years before. I kept it light. I said I'd come across an old envelope while helping Dad, something about a trust with my mother's name on it. And did she know anything about it? The temperature dropped exactly the way it always had. But this time, I was watching for it, and I saw something new underneath the cold. A flash of something fast and animal that she covered almost instantly. Fear. Again, the same fear my father had. "There's no envelope," she said. You're imagining things. You always did have a vivid imagination about yourself, Myra. Always sure there was some big secret reason you were so special. She smiled the church smile. There isn't. Some people are just hard to warm to. That's not a conspiracy. That's a personality. It was a masterful little speech. If I'd been the girl I used to be, it would have landed clean. It would have made me doubt my own eyes, apologize, retreat. That's what it had always done. But I had held that envelope in my own 2 hands. I had read the firm's name with my own eyes. And a woman who had nothing to hide does not respond to a simple question about a piece of paper by attacking the questioner's grip on reality. That's not innocence. That's a tactic. I'd seen it from families who were hiding bed sores from the state inspector. Deny the thing, then make the witness the problem. I smiled back, said maybe I was mistaken, and let it go. I let her think it worked. Then I drove the 25 minutes back to my apartment, sat down at my little kitchen table under the good light, and looked up the phone number for the county recorder's office. Before I could even make that call, my phone rang with a number I didn't expect. Gerald Pete, Sandra's younger brother, a lawyer with a small practice 2 towns over, a man who had hovered at the edges of every family event my whole life, with the watchful patience of a man guarding something. We were not close. Gerald had never once called me in 34 years. He called me now. Myra, he said, warm as a salesman. Heard your dad's doing better. Good. Good. Listen. Sandra mentioned you've been asking about some old paperwork. I just want to say, as the family's attorney, you should really let sleeping dogs lie. Your father's heart can't take stress right now. Dredging up your mother's affairs, things from before you were old enough to understand them. It'll only hurt him. You don't want that on your conscience, do you? A nurse like you. It was the most words Gerald had ever said to me at once, and every one of them was a thread in a net. Stress for my father, my conscience. My profession turned into a tiny leash. He didn't threaten me. He was far too smooth for that. He warned me lovingly, the way you'd warn someone away from a cliff edge. Except the cliff was clearly something he didn't want me to see over. Here is the thing about being a hospice nurse. I have sat with hundreds of families in the worst weeks of their lives, when the masks slip and you see who people really are around money and death. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone is protecting a grieving man. And I know exactly what it sounds like when someone is protecting themselves and calling it love. Gerald was doing the second one, the family lawyer calling out of nowhere to talk me out of reading a document about my own mother. I thanked him for his concern, then I made my appointment with the county. There was a name that had floated up out of my childhood when I started making my list. Adler, an old woman who used to live on the next property over, back when my mother was alive. I remembered her vaguely, the way you remember a smell. I did some asking around and she was still alive, still local. Moved into a tidy little house in town near the library. I brought a plant because I always bring a plant, and I knocked on a Saturday morning. The woman who answered was in her late 70s, small and sharp-eyed with a cardigan and a grip stronger than it had any right to be. She looked at me for a long moment in the doorway. Then her eyes filled just slightly, and she said something that took the floor out from under me. "Oh," she said softly, "you have Helen's hands." Nobody had ever told me I looked like my mother. Nobody in my family would have said her name, let alone compared us. I stood there holding a fern, 34 years old, undone by one sentence from a stranger. Mrs. Adler invited me in. She made tea, and slowly, carefully, like someone deciding whether a bridge will hold weight, she started to talk. She had known my mother well. They'd been close. Young mothers on neighboring farms, the way women out there got close over canning and crises and the long quiet of rural winters. She told me my mother had been funny and stubborn and that she'd loved that house more than anything except me. And then Mrs. Adler sat down her teacup and said, "There's something I've been holding for you a long time. Helen made me promise." She said, "Give it to Myra when she's grown and when she comes asking, not before." She looked at me. "You came asking." And she got up slower now and went down the hall to find it. While she was gone, I sat very still in that little living room. The way I sit still in a patient's room when the family has stepped out. And it's just me and the machines and the truth. When Mrs. Adler came back, she was carrying a wooden box, cedar, by the smell of it, about the size of a bread loaf. The lid worn smooth by someone's hands. She held it a moment before she gave it to me, like she was saying goodbye to it. Before you open it, she said, you should know what kind of woman your mother was, so you understand why she did what she did. And she told me, my mother, Helen Frost, had grown up on that land. The farmhouse and the acreage had come down through her family. The Frosts, not my father's. It was hers. Her name on it. Her people's graves in the little plot at the back of the property. When she got sick in her early 30s, she got sick fast. And the thing that frightened her, Mrs. Adler said, was not dying. It was what would happen to me afterward. She loved your father, Mrs. Adler said carefully. But she didn't trust him to hold the line. He was a good man and a weak one. She was terrified that after she was gone, someone would talk him into signing the house away or selling your roots out from under you, and you'd grow up with nothing of hers, not even the ground she came from. She looked at the box in my hands. So, she made sure that couldn't happen. She did it the only way the law would let her. And then she made me promise that if the day ever came when you came looking confused, grown, sensing something was wrong, I'd give you this and tell you the truth. My hands were not steady anymore. Open it, she said. So I did. Inside the cedar box on top was a letter. The paper was soft with age, folded in thirds. My name written across the front in a hand I had never seen, and somehow recognized in my chest before my eyes finished reading it. To Myra. I unfolded it. The ink had gone brown, the handwriting was looping and a little hurried, the writing of a woman racing a clock she couldn't beat. Myra Bird. It began. And I had to stop and breathe, because that was a name I had no memory of, and my whole body remembered being called. She wrote that she was sorry she wouldn't get to see who I became. She wrote that she knew I'd be strong because I'd come from strong women who held on to their land through droughts and debts, and men who underestimated them. And then she wrote the line that I have not been able to forget. The line I will hear in her voice. A voice I can't actually remember until the day I die. The house is yours, Myra Baird. I put it somewhere they can't sell your roots out from under you. When you're grown, it comes to you. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong in your own home. Under the letter was a photograph of a young woman laughing on the farmhouse porch, with a baby on her hip. Her and me, I understood, though I'd never seen it. And under that, folded and stamped and official-looking even through the dust, was a photocopy of a document. The header read, The Helen Frost Living Trust. And below it, language I'd seen 100 times in a 100 patient files when families sorted out their dead. The transfer of real property, a legal description of the farmhouse and acreage into the trust. I am not a crier. I've trained myself out of it. It doesn't help my patients. I sat in Mrs. Adler's living room and I did not cry. But I held that copy in both hands and I understood finally the shape of the lie I'd been living inside of. The disappointment in the family wasn't a personality, it was a cover story, and the thing it covered was a house. I didn't sleep that night, but not the way you don't sleep when you're falling apart. I didn't sleep the way I don't sleep before a hard shift when I'm running the plan. I sat at my kitchen table with the cedar box and a legal pad, and I treated the whole thing like a complicated case because that copy in the box, as much as it shook me, was just a copy, a faded photocopy of a document from before I could read. It proved what my mother had intended. Snorts. It did not by itself prove what was legally true right now, 28 years later. Trusts can be amended. Trusts can be dissolved. Property can be moved out of them. For all I knew, my father, as whoever he was in this arrangement, had unwound the whole thing legally years ago, and the house really did belong to him and Sandra now, fair and square, and the only crime was that they'd lied to me about my mother out of grief and cowardice. That would still be a betrayal, but it wouldn't be the kind you can do anything about. So I made 2 columns on the legal pad. The way I do, what I know, what I need to find out. I knew my mother had created a trust and put the house in it for me. I needed to find out whether that trust still existed, whether the house was still in it, who the trustee was, and what they'd been doing for 28 years. There's a clean way to answer the first part of that. Deeds are public record. When you put a house into a trust, you record a new deed at the county, and anyone can walk in and look at the chain of title. They count on you never looking. They count on you being too small, too sad, too convinced you don't deserve to ask. I had spent my whole life being exactly that. I was done. Monday morning I had homework. The county recorder's office was in the basement of the courthouse, fluorescent and quiet, smelling of old paper and burnt coffee. I'd taken a personal day. I told the clerk I wanted to look up the chain of title on a property, and I gave her the address of the farmhouse. She didn't blink. People do this all the time. Buyers, surveyors, nosy neighbors, heirs. She showed me how to search by parcel number and pulled up the records on a public terminal. And then she left me alone with 28 years of my family's secrets scrolling on a beige monitor. I went backward in time. The most recent documents were unremarkable. A few liens against the property I'd come back to. A mortgage. Then going back, I found it. A deed recorded the year I turned 6, the year my mother died. It transferred the farmhouse and the acreage from Helen Frost, an unmarried-style legal description of her sole ownership, into the Helen Frost Living Trust. There it was in the public record, exactly as the copy in the cedar box had said. The house had gone into my mother's trust. And then I kept scrolling forward, my heart doing a slow, hard knock against my ribs, waiting for the document that would undo it. The deed transferring it back out to my father, to Sandra, to anyone. I scrolled through the whole chain twice. That deed did not exist. There was no transfer out of the trust, not in 28 years. The house I grew up in, the house where I was told I didn't belong, the house where my chair was about to be carried to the wall. That house had been sitting inside my dead mother's trust in my name the entire time. Everyone in my family had been living all these years in a house that legally was not theirs to give, to keep, or to hold over me. The clerk came back to check on me. "Find what you needed?" she asked. I said yes. I needed a lawyer. Small towns leak. The clerk who'd help me was perfectly professional, but the courthouse basement is not a sealed room. And a county where everyone's cousin works somewhere means word travels by Tuesday. What you did on Monday. By the time I got home, there was a voicemail from Gerald, and his salesman warmth had developed an edge. "Myra, I understand you've been at the courthouse pulling records on the family home." A pause, calculating. "I really must advise you both as the family's attorney and as someone who cares about your father. Stop. Whatever you think you found, you don't understand the full context. These are complicated matters. You could do real legal harm to people you love, expose your father to liability, and frankly embarrass yourself. Let me handle it. Come see me and I'll explain everything. Come see me and I'll explain everything." Translation: come into my office where I control the documents and the narrative and let me talk you back into being small. I did not call him back. Instead, I sat with the fact that Gerald, a working attorney, was this frightened of me reading public records. You don't get scared of someone confirming a fact unless the fact is a problem for you specifically. If the trust had been legally unwound, if everything was clean, Gerald's move would have been easy. He'd have invited me in, shown me the dissolution paperwork, and sent me home embarrassed for doubting. He didn't do that. He tried to stop me from looking at all. A man only blocks the door when he knows what's behind it. And the more I thought about Gerald, Sandra's brother, the family lawyer, present at every turn, the more a darker question formed. Somebody had to have kept this quiet for 28 years. Somebody had to have made sure the paperwork stayed buried, that the legal duties a trust requires were never performed, that a 6-year-old grew into a 34-year-old who never knew, somebody with the training to do it. I thought I knew who. The old envelope I'd seen in the hospital had a law firm's name on it, and though I'd only had it in my hand for a few seconds before my father snatched it back, I'm trained to remember details under pressure. I remembered enough. The original firm had closed years ago, but small firms get absorbed and their files go somewhere. After a few phone calls, I found the successor practice. a two-attorney office in the county seat that had taken over the old firm's estate files when the founding partner retired. I made an appointment with a woman named Carol Vance. I brought everything: the cedar box, my mother's letter, the photocopy, and the printouts I'd made at the county. Carol Vance was about 50, gray-suited with reading glasses on a chain, and the unhurried manner of someone who has watched a great many families come apart over money and is no longer surprised by any of it. She listened to my whole story without interrupting, which is rarer than you'd think. Then she put on the glasses and read the letter and the photocopy and the deed printouts. She was quiet for a while. "Give me a few minutes," she said. "We may still have the underlying file." She went into a back room. I sat there in a stranger's office and I noticed my own hands, my mother's hands, folded in my lap, steady again now that there was a task in front of them. When Carol came back, she was carrying a thin accordion folder, soft at the corners with a faded label. She set it on the desk between us and looked at me over the glasses, and her expression had changed. Lawyers learn to keep flat faces. Hers wasn't flat anymore. "Miss Frost," she said slowly, "I want to make sure I understand. Your family has been telling you your entire life that this house is theirs, and no one ever told you about this trust." "No one," I said. She tapped the folder. "Then you should know what's in here because somebody had a legal duty to tell you, and they didn't." I wasn't trying to win anything that morning in Carol Vance's office. I want you to understand that I wasn't after revenge or a house or money. I was after one thing: an answer to the question I'd been forbidden to ask since I was 8 years old. Why? Why a dying woman had to hide a home from her own husband. One had been Katz's disappointment in a story I never wrote. If your gut has ever told you a family story didn't add up, you know this feeling. Comment if you felt it. Subscribe and stay with me because this is where it stopped being a feeling and became a fact. Carol Vance opened the folder and walked me through it page by page in the patient voice of someone diffusing something. The Helen Frost Living Trust was real and it was still in force. My Snort's mother had created it the year before she died. She had transferred the farmhouse and the land into it. That was the deed I'd already found. The terms were not complicated, which Carol said was a small mercy. My mother had named me Myra Frost as the sole beneficiary. The house and land were to be held in trust for me until I turned 35, at which point they were to be distributed to me outright, free and clear, and she had named a trustee to manage the property in the meantime, to maintain it, to act in my interests until that day came. The trustee was my father, Raymond. "A trustee is not an owner," Carol said, watching my face. "A trustee is a fiduciary. He holds the property for the beneficiary, for you. He has legal duties to preserve the asset, to act in your interest, to keep you informed, to provide accountings." She let that land. "Miss Frost, based on what you've told me, your father has done essentially none of those things for 28 years. He's treated trust property as personal property. He's allowed others to treat it as theirs, and he never told the beneficiary the trust existed." For the first time in my entire life, I knew something my family didn't know. I knew. The house wasn't theirs. It had never stopped being mine. Then Carol asked me my date of birth, and when I told her, she went still and checked a page and looked up. "Myra," she said quietly, "you turned 35 this month." I did the count out loud because I needed to hear it. Thanksgiving was the 4th Thursday. My birthday was that Saturday, 3 days after Thanksgiving, I said. Carol nodded slowly. 3 days after Thanksgiving, she said, "This property is legally yours outright. The clock your mother set 28 years ago runs out that weekend." She took off her glasses. "The question is, what you want to do with the time before then." What I wanted first was to understand exactly how bad it was, not for revenge, but because I needed the floor under my feet to be solid before I stepped onto it. Carol laid it out. Concealing the existence of a trust from its beneficiary is a breach of fiduciary duty. Failing to provide accountings for nearly 3 decades is a breach. Treating trust assets as your own. Lem in the home rent-free as if you owned it which a trustee may sometimes do under certain terms, but more importantly, allowing others to encumber it could be a serious breach, depending on what had been done to the property. And that's where it got worse. Carol had pulled the recent records too. The same liens I'd glimpsed at the county. "There's debt recorded against this house," she said. "Recent? Someone borrowed against a property they don't own." She looked at me. "Do you know who in your family has been treating this house as collateral?" I thought about the new car. The business was always posting about the event planning company with the expensive logo and the rented downtown space. "I think I do," I said. Carol nodded grimly and explained what that meant. As beneficiary, once the trust distributed to me, I would have standing to demand a full accounting, to seek the removal of the trustee, and to address the debts that had been improperly placed against my property. None of it would be handed to me. I'd have to file, I'd have to assert it. I'd have to be willing to take my own father to a probate court and call what he did by its legal name. "It's your decision," Carol said. "Some people, when they learn this, decide they just want the house and want to walk away from the family entirely. Some want a full reckoning. Both are valid, but you have a narrow window. And after your birthday, some doors open and others get harder, so I need to know." She slid a legal pad toward me. "What do you actually want, Myra?" Before I answered the biggest question of my life, I wanted one more piece. The file in front of Carol had a history of who had touched it, and I asked her to walk me through it. The original attorney who drafted the trust, my mother's lawyer, had handled it cleanly. The problem started after he retired. The file showed correspondence over the years, requests and responses, and a name kept appearing: Gerald Puit, identifying himself as counsel for the trustee. Gerald, Sandra's brother. For 2 decades, Gerald had been the lawyer in a loop on this trust, and Carol, reading the record with a deepening frown, pointed out what was missing: no accountings filed, no notice to the beneficiary. And that, she explained, was exactly how a thing like this stays buried for decades. Every piece of trust correspondence went by law and by design to the trustee's own address, the farmhouse, where Gerald saw to it that none of it was ever forwarded to the beneficiary who wasn't supposed to know she was one. Nothing was filed, so there was nothing to leak. And the one neighbor who knew the truth had been sworn by my dying mother to say nothing until I came asking on my own. At one point years back, a letter from the old firm asking whether the trustee intended to inform the beneficiary as she approached adulthood, and a reply on Gerald's letterhead saying the trustee considered it not in the family's interest at this time. Not in the family's interest. A grown attorney, my stepmother's brother, had put in writing that keeping a young woman ignorant of her own inheritance was in the family's interest. It wasn't grief. It wasn't my weak, sad father drowning in memory. It was a strategy drafted and maintained by a professional who knew exactly what the law required and chose year after year to do the opposite. The dislike I'd felt from that family my whole life, the careful, consistent coldness, clicked into a new and uglier shape. They hadn't disliked me into the role of disappointment by accident. They'd needed me small. They'd needed me convinced I deserved nothing. So I'd never go looking, never ask the questions that would lead me to a courthouse basement and the cedar box. Every birthday card that told me not to expect too much. Every comparison to Brooke, it had a purpose. Carol watched me put it together. "Now you understand the why," she said gently. "So, what do you want to do about it?" I thought about Carol's question for a long time, long enough that she let me sit with it in silence, which I appreciated. The honest first feeling was rage. Clean, hot, snorts, satisfying rage. The kind that wants to make a scene, post the documents, scream the truth at a holiday table until the whole town hears. I let myself feel it, then I set it down because I know what rage does. I've watched too many families let it run the show. And it never builds anything, it just burns. The people who done this to me had used loud public emotional weapons my entire life. Sandra's specialty was humiliation, the lifted eyebrow, the cutting comparison, the public little cruelties that made me doubt myself. Gerald's weapon was the leash of soft warnings. They were people of performance and pressure. So I decided I would not fight them with their weapons, I would fight them with mine. I don't yell, I document. I would let Carol prepare everything properly, certify copies of the recorded deed, A letter laying out the trust, my status as beneficiary, the upcoming distribution date, and a formal demand for an accounting paper. Quiet, patient, devastating paper. And I would deliver the truth, the one way that couldn't be denied, spun, or buried in front of witnesses. Calmly with the documents in hand, and then I would walk away and let the facts do the work that no amount of screaming ever could. There's a certain elegance to that, Carol said, and I think she meant it. We made a plan. She'd prepare a clean packet of certified documents. The trust would distribute on its own schedule the Saturday after Thanksgiving. That part was automatic, written by my mother decades ago. And the accounting demand, the trustee removal, the matter of the debt Brooke had hung on my house that would follow properly through the courts. After, when do you want to tell them? Carol asked. I already knew. At Thanksgiving, I said, at the table. 2 days before Thanksgiving, my father called me. Not Sandra's bright command, not Gerald's smooth warning. My father alone, at an hour when I guessed Sandra wasn't in the room. His voice was thin. Myra, he said, Are you coming Thursday? I said, I was. There was a long pause, the kind I know from deathbeds. The pause of a person standing at the edge of saying something true and afraid of the drop. Your mother, he started. Helen, there are things I should have. And then I heard it in the background, Sandra's voice, sharp. Raymond, who are you talking to? And the truth he'd been on the very edge of saying folded itself back up. Just drive safe, my father said quickly, and the warmth went flat and false. Don't bring anything. Sandra's got it handled. He hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand. For one moment, hearing that thin, frightened voice, I felt the old pull, the daughter's pull, the wish to make it easy for him to walk in Thursday and pretend to spare a sick old man the reckoning. I'd spent my life sparing them. But then I thought about what that call really was. He'd known for 28 years, as he had known the house was mine, known there was a letter, known his daughter was being raised to believe she was worthless inside a home she owned. And he had let it happen. And even now, even on the phone, even when he had the chance to finally tell me himself, before it all came out, he had folded the moment Sandra spoke. That was who my father was, not a monster. A man who, given a choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable silence, would choose the silence every single time and let me pay for it. The pity I felt was real. I let it be real. And then I set it next to the facts where it belonged, and I kept my appointment with the table. The day before Thanksgiving, Carol called with the last piece. She'd run down the lines recorded against the property, and the picture was as bad as we'd feared. Brooke had taken out a substantial loan to fund her event planning business, and she'd secured it against the farmhouse, pledged the house as collateral, the house she believed would be hers someday, the house she did not own and never would. The loan was significant, the kind that doesn't get approved without real property behind it. Brooke had been running her whole glossy little empire on the back of my inheritance, and she didn't know it. None of them did. They thought the house was the family's, and Brooke was the heir apparent. The loan had gone through because my father, the man everyone, the bank included, believed owned this house, free and clear, had signed for it as the apparent owner, with Gerald handling the paperwork that made it all look routine. And because a quick title search turns up nothing alarming if you don't know to ask whose trust the place has been sitting in for 28 years. It was one more thing my father had signed away that was never his to sign. When the property distributes to you, Carol explained, and the situation comes to light, that loan is going to become a very serious problem for your sister. The collateral was never hers to pledge. Lenders take a dim view of that. So does the law. I thought about Brooke, the eyebrow, the way she'd narrowed her eyes at me across 30 years of holidays, the way she'd taught herself to make me feel like an intruder fluently since childhood. I'd always assumed her coldness was just inherited, learned at Sandra's knee. Now I understood there was a harder engine under it. Brooke had the most to lose if I ever stopped being the disappointment and started being a person who asked questions. Her car, her business, her whole carefully posted life sat on a foundation that was legally mine. No wonder she'd worked so hard to keep me small. A person fighting for their financial life fights dirty, and Brooke had been fighting for hers against me since before either of us understood the stakes. She still didn't understand them. She would on Thursday. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and assembled the envelope. I want to be clear about what was in it because it mattered to me that it be truth and not theater. Carol had prepared a clean packet, a certified copy of the recorded deed showing the farmhouse held in the Helen Frost Living Trust, a letter on her firm's letterhead, plainly stating that I, Myra Frost, was the sole beneficiary, that the trust would distribute the property to me outright that coming Saturday, and that a formal accounting would be demanded of the trustee. It was not a weapon you could argue with. It was just what was true, finally written down where everyone could see it. I made a second, smaller envelope, too, and set it aside for Danny. Not documents, just a note. Because of all of them, he was the one I refused to let get caught in the blast without a hand reaching back for him. Then, I sat with the white envelope in front of me for a long while. I thought about my mother writing my name on a letter while she was dying, trusting that one day a grown woman she'd never meet would find it and be strong enough to do what she couldn't stay alive to do herself. I thought about the gatepost, the square of newer paint, and I understood at last what had been there. The name Frost. They'd painted over my mother's name on the gate of my mother's house, and they'd spent 28 years painting over it on me. I wasn't angry anymore sitting there. I'd moved past angry into something quieter and much harder to stop. I was ready. I put the envelope in my bag. I laid out the clothes I'd wear. Nothing dramatic, just clean and plain. The clothes of a woman, with nowhere to hide because she'd finally stopped hiding. Then I slept all the way through the night for the first time in 3 weeks. Thanksgiving morning, before I even left, my phone buzzed. It was Danny, my little brother, 22 now, the boy who used to leave rolls outside my door. His text was simple, and it nearly undid all my careful calm. "Hey, Mom's in a real mood today. Already snapping about the seating and going on about you. I don't know what's up, but maybe skip this year. For your own sake, you don't have to keep showing up just to get treated like that. I mean it. Love you, sis. Love you, sis." Words I had received from exactly one person in that family ever, and it was the youngest one, the one with the least power and the most heart. I sat on the edge of my bed and read it twice, going on about you, already snapping about the seating. So Sandra had something planned. Of course she did. Word had reached her through Gerald or the courthouse grapevine that I'd been digging, and her response was not fear that she'd be exposed. She didn't know how close I was. Her response was to double down on the old strategy. Put the disappointment back in her place hard in front of everyone. So the questioning stopped. She was going to make an example of me at that table. She had no idea she was setting her own stage. I texted Danny back, "I'm coming. But I promise you, whatever happens today, you're not in trouble. And you never did anything wrong. Just stay calm and stay out of the way when it gets loud. Trust me. And Danny, thank you for the rolls. I never forgot." I don't know if he understood that last part. He'd have been too young to remember. But I needed to say it to the one person who'd seen the crooked table for what it was when he was 4 years old and tried to fix it with bread. Then I got in my car and drove the 25 minutes out to the house that in 2 days would be mine. The drive out was the same drive I'd made 1,000 times. Gravel road, cedar tree, the gate post with its patch of newer paint. But everything looked different now. The way a room looks different after you learn someone died in it or was born in it. I drove past fields my mother's family had worked. Past the little fenced plot at the back where her people were buried, where she was buried. Though I'd been brought to that grave maybe twice in my life, and never on purpose. I pulled into the driveway behind Brooke's expensive SUV and my father's old truck and a couple of cars I didn't recognize. Relatives, the cousin from Ohio, maybe a neighbor or two, a full house, plenty of witnesses. I sat in my car for a moment in the driveway of a house that in 72 hours would legally be mine, looking at the porch where a young woman had once laughed with a baby on her hip. The same porch, the same boards, probably. I thought about how many Thanksgivings I'd walked up those steps feeling like a beggar at a feast, swallowing the lump in my throat, rehearsing how to be small enough to be tolerated. Not today. I wasn't there to be tolerated. I wasn't even there for revenge. Not really. Whatever Sandra would scream later, I was there to put a thing back where it belonged. The truth on the table in the light. I checked my bag. The white envelope was there, square and certain. I left my mother's cedar box at home safe, but I'd put her photograph in my coat pocket, the one of her laughing on this porch, because I wanted some part of her at the table she'd fought to save for me. I got out of the car. The smell of turkey and wood smoke came across the yard. The smell of every childhood holiday I'd survived. I climbed the steps. I opened the door of my own house, and I walked into the last Thanksgiving they would ever run. Inside it was warm and loud and bright, the way that house only ever was for everyone but me. The table was set long down the middle of the dining room. The good cloth, the good plates, candles already lit even though it was barely afternoon. Sandra was at the head of it in her hosting glory, directing traffic, and she clocked me the second I came in, her eyes doing a quick, cold sweep that took in my plain clothes and my steady face, and apparently found both annoying. Brooke was setting out water glasses, baby Lily on her hip. My little niece, 3 years old, entirely innocent, gnawing on a roll, and my heart caught at the sight of her because whatever happened today, that child had done nothing. And I'd already promised myself she never would pay for it. My father sat in his chair near the head, looking smaller than he used to, his color still off from the heart trouble, and he met my eyes for half a second and then looked away. And that half second told me everything about how the day was going to go. Gerald was there too, which I hadn't been sure of. Sandra's brother, the family attorney, holding a glass of wine and watching me over the rim of it with an expression that was trying very hard to look casual and wasn't quite managing. He knew I'd been to the courthouse. He didn't know what I'd found or that Carol Vance existed, or that there was a certified envelope in my bag. He was nervous. Good. Danny appeared from the kitchen, saw me, and gave me a small, worried smile, and I gave him one back to tell him it was all right. I hung my coat by the door, the photograph still in the pocket, and I went to take my usual seat near the foot of the table, the seat I'd occupied my whole life. The cheap seats, the disappointment seat. That was when Sandra stood up. Sandra stood up and the room felt it before anyone understood why. She had a flair for these moments. She'd been staging them my whole life, but always in miniature, a comment here, a slight there. This one she'd decided to make big. She walked down the length of the table, past the candles and the good plates, to the chair. I was reaching for my chair, the one always set for me at the far end. And she put her hand on its back. "Oh, Myra," she said in that bright church voice, loud enough to carry, loud enough to stop every other conversation in the room. "There's been a little change. We're a bit tight on space this year with the baby and all." And then, watching me, savoring it, she pulled the chair out from the table, carried it across the room, and set it against the far wall by the sideboard, away from the table entirely. A chair against the wall, a place that was not a place. The room went silent. The cousin from Ohio looked at her plate. Brooke smirked and shifted Lily on her hip. My father stared into the candle flames like a man praying for the floor to take him. And Sandra straightened up from the chair she'd just exiled and delivered the line she'd clearly been polishing all morning. The line that was the whole point. The line that was just the newest verse of a song she'd been singing at me for 28 years. "There's no room for disappointments at this table," she said. She said it gently. She said it almost sweetly, the way she said all her worst things, so that later she could swear she'd only been talking about chairs. The old me would have died on the spot. The old me would have flushed red, mumbled something, and gone to sit by the wall because that's where I'd been taught I belonged. I stood very still and felt, instead of shame, the strangest thing. Calm. Total oceanic calm. The calm of a nurse when the monitor flatlines and everyone else panics, and somebody has to be steady. I was steady. I didn't go to the wall. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry and I didn't argue because I'd learned a long time ago that you can't argue someone out of cruelty they've practiced for 3 decades. You can only outlast it and then out-truth it. I set my bag down on the corner of the table slow and deliberate, and the small ordinary sound of it made everyone look. I picked up the white envelope and I spoke in the voice I used to tell a family that their mother has hours left. Quiet, level, kind, and absolutely impossible to ignore. "You're right, Sandra," I said. "There isn't room at this table for disappointments." A flicker of triumph crossed her face. It died fast because I wasn't finished. So, let's talk about who the real disappointment at this table actually is. Let's talk about what's been disappointing for 28 years. Sandra's smile stiffened. Gerald set his wine glass down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to sweat. My father finally looked up at me and his eyes were wet and he gave the smallest shake of his head. Please, Myra, no. Not here. It was the most he'd ever asked of me with his eyes. And it was like everything he'd ever given me. 28 years too late. Dad, I said, turning to him gentler now because I did love him. God help me. Even then, I came across some old paperwork while you were in the hospital. You remember the envelope you grabbed back? I've been doing some reading since then. I held up the white envelope. Turns out, I'm a very thorough reader. Must be the nurse in me. We read the chart, even when the family says everything's fine. I looked around the silent table. All those faces, the witnesses my mother would have wanted. I finally know, I said. Why you've all hated me. And I walked the length of the table to my father's place, and I set the envelope down on his plate. For a moment, nobody moved. The envelope sat on my father's plate, white against the good china, and everyone in that room stared at it like it might go off. Open it, Dad, I said. He didn't. His hand stayed in his lap, trembling. So Sandra, who could never bear to not be in control of a room, snatched it up herself. This is ridiculous, she said, whatever little drama you've cooked up. She tore it open. She pulled out the certified deed and Carol Vance's letter, and she started to read fast, her eyes flicking across the lines, ready to find the flaw, the bluff, the embarrassing nothing she could wave away. I watched the exact second the words stopped meaning what she wanted them to mean. I watched the color leave her face. She read it again, her mouth opened and closed. What is this? She said, but it wasn't really a question anymore. So, I answered it for the whole table, in plain words, because plain words were the entire point. That's a certified copy of the deed to this house, I said. It shows that my mother, Helen Frost, put this farmhouse and all this land into a trust before she died. A trust with one beneficiary. Me. I let it sit. This house has been held in my name since I was 6 years old. Not Dad's. Not yours, Sandra. Mine. It has never legally belonged to either of you. You've been living in my house at my table telling me I didn't belong here for 28 years. Brooke had gone still. Lily forgotten on her hip. Gerald was the color of paste, and my father had put his face in his hands. And this Saturday, I went on. On my 35th birthday, the trust ends and the house comes to me outright. The way my mother arranged it, the way she made sure no one could ever sell my roots out from under me. I looked at Sandra. She knew. She knew what you'd try to do. She was right. My father took his hands away from his face. And what was there wasn't anger. It was something worse for both of us. It was a man looking at the exact debt he'd known would come due his entire life. Myra, he said, and his voice cracked on my name. I was going to tell you. I kept. Every year I told myself I'd tell you. And there it was, the deepest cut, the one I'd half known and hadn't let myself fully believe until I heard it, in his own mouth. He'd known, not been deceived, not been kept in the dark by Sandra and Gerald. Known from the beginning he had been the trustee. My mother dying had trusted the man she loved to hold her daughter's home safe and hand it over when the time came. And instead he had let his second wife move in and rule it. Let her raise his first wife's child as the household disappointment. Let Gerald bury the paperwork. Let his other daughter borrow against it. And every single year he had looked at me across this table and said nothing. You were going to tell me. I repeated quiet. For 28 years, you were going to tell me. I wasn't shouting. I think the not shouting was what broke him. Dad, I sat with you in the ICU at 2 in the morning. I held your hand. You could have told me then. You could have told me on the phone 2 days ago. I heard you start to stop the second she walked in. You always stop the second she walks in. He was weeping now openly. An old sick man crying at the head of a table that was never his, and I felt it, the pull, the daughter's ancient wish to go to him, to make it okay. I didn't move. Some things you cannot make okay. And pretending you can is just another way of lying. I don't hate you, I told him, and it was true. But I finally understand you. You'd rather be comfortable than honest. You always would. And I paid for your comfort my whole life. That was when Sandra detonated. She'd been holding the deed, watching her husband confess in front of relatives and neighbors, watching 28 years of careful staging come apart. And something in her gave way. She threw the papers down on the table. You ungrateful little. Her voice climbed, shrill and cracking, nothing like the church voice now. We raised you. We fed you. We housed you. We hosed you. We put a roof over your head. My roof, I said level. And this is how you repay this family? Sneaking around carouses, hiring lawyers, ambushing your sick father on a holiday? She was shaking. The mask was entirely gone, and under it was exactly what I'd glimpsed in the kitchen weeks before. Not a cruel queen, but a frightened woman who had built her whole life on a foundation she'd known all along was stolen. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're going to put us out of our home. It was never your home. I said it as gently as she'd ever said anything to me, and it hit the room like a slap because it was true. And everyone there now knew it was true. And then I gave her back her own words. The words she'd carried to my chair not 10 minutes earlier. The words she'd been saying to me one way or another since I was a child. You told me there's no room at this table for disappointment. Sandra, you were right. There isn't. I looked around at all of it. The candles, the good china, the long table in the long room of my mother's house. So I'm taking the room back from the people who were actually the disappointments. Starting with the woman who spent 28 years convincing a little girl she was worthless, so that little girl would never look too closely at her own home. Sandra opened her mouth and nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, I had watched her run out of words. She sat down hard in her chair at the head of the table, and even that I thought even her grand hostess chair was mine. Brooke found her voice next, and it shook. This doesn't change anything, she said, but her eyes were already doing math, the same math I'd done 2 days before in Carol's office. The house, fine, whatever. But my business, I have a loan, I have plans. She stopped because she heard herself. I looked at my sister, who'd spent 30 years perfecting the art of making me feel like an intruder. And for the first time, I felt something close to pity, because she'd just realized in front of everyone what she'd built her life on. You took a loan against this house, I said quietly. You used it as collateral. I know, Brooke. It's in the public record, same as everything else. You borrowed against a house that was never yours to pledge. The blood drained out of her face. That's a serious problem. Not one I'm creating. One that's been sitting there since you signed the papers. When the house comes to me, that collateral disappears. Whatever you built on it. I didn't finish. I didn't need to. She sank into her chair, clutching Lily, and the baby, sensing the storm, started to fuss. Then I turned to Gerald, who had been edging toward the door, and I watched him freeze. And you, I said, family attorney, you were counsel on my mother's trust for 20 years. You knew I was the beneficiary. You wrote in your own letterhead that informing me wasn't in the family's interest. You buried it. You skipped every accounting the law required. You sat in this house at holidays knowing whose house it was, and you helped them keep me in the dark. Gerald started to say something lawyerly, something about complications and context, and I stopped him with one sentence. My attorney is Carol Vance. She has the file, all of it. There will be a formal accounting demand, a petition to remove the trustee, and a complaint to the state bar with your name on it. The wine glass he'd set down so carefully earlier. He picked it up again now, purely to have something to hold, and his hand was shaking so badly the wine trembled. He didn't make it to the door, but he stopped pretending he was a person who could fix this. There were 2 people at that table I had no quarrel with, and I made sure the whole room heard me say so, because catharsis without mercy is just cruelty wearing a nicer coat. And I refused to become what they'd raised me to fear. I turned to Danny, who was standing in the kitchen doorway looking like he wanted to disappear. The only person in that family who'd ever shown me kindness for free. Danny, I said, and my voice changed, softened all the way. None of this is about you. You hear me? You were a kid. You did nothing wrong. You did the only right thing in this whole house. And you were 4 years old when you did it. His eyes were wet. When the house is mine, there's a place in it for you. If you want it, a fair one. We'll work it out, you and me, like family's supposed to. You're not getting put out on the street. Not ever. Not by me. Then I looked at Brooke, who was rocking Lily. Both of them crying now, and I made myself say the harder thing, the necessary thing. And Lily is my niece. Whatever happens with you and me, Brooke, and a lot is going to happen. That child will never go without a roof while I have one. I won't punish a 3-year-old for what the adults in this room did. That's not who I am. That's the difference between me and the people who raised me. Sandra flinched at that hard like I'd struck her. And maybe I had with the only weapon that ever really lands, being out loud in front of everyone the better person. Willie reached out one small hand toward me the way babies do, indiscriminate and forgiving, and I touched her tiny fingers for just a second. Then I stepped back. I'd said what I came to say. I'd put the truth on the table and I'd kept my own hands clean while doing it. I went to the far wall to the chair Sandra had carried there to shame me. The chair that was supposed to be my place that was not a place. I picked it up. The room watched me, silent, except for Lily's quieting hiccups and the small, steady sounds of candles burning. I carried the chair back to the table, to the spot where it had always been set for me, and I pushed it in. Neat and square, the way you leave a room you're done with. I wasn't going to sit in it. I'd lost my appetite for that table a long time ago, and I knew it now. But I wasn't going to let her last act be the one that stood. The chair belonged at the table. So did I. The difference was that I no longer needed their permission for either. I picked up my bag. I looked at them all one more time, my father weeping into his hands. Sandra rigid and gray in the seat she'd ruled from. Brooke clutching the baby and her ruined plans. Gerald frozen with his trembling whine. Danny crying quietly in the doorway with something in his face that might have been the first clean breath he'd taken in years. My whole family finally seeing me. Finally knowing exactly who I was, which was the one thing they'd spend my whole life in a dead woman's house trying to prevent. Happy Thanksgiving, I said. I meant it without any venom at all, which I think unsettled them more than screaming would have. Then I took my coat from the hook by the door. And I felt my mother's photograph in the pocket, her young face, laughing on this porch. And I walked out of the house that would be mine in 2 days, down the steps, past the gatepost with its patch of newer paint, and I drove the 25 minutes back to my apartment with the windows down, breathing. That Saturday, on my 35th birthday, the Helen Frost Living Trust did exactly what my mother had built it to do 28 years earlier, with no help from me and no permission from anyone. The farmhouse and the land distributed to me outright, free and clear. Carol handled the paperwork. The first time I drove out as the legal owner, I stopped at the gate, got a can of paint and a brush from the hardware store on the way, and I scraped the patch off the gatepost. Underneath, faint but there, carved into the old wood, was the name Frost. I painted it fresh and white so you could read it from the road. The accounting demand went out the following week. A trust doesn't simply vanish the day it distributes. It stays open until the trustee has accounted for every year he managed it, and my father had 28 years to answer for the debts he'd allowed against my house. The rents and lease money that should have been mine, the duties he never performed, he didn't fight any of it. I suspect some part of him was relieved to finally set down a thing he'd carried so badly for so long. Sandra and Raymond had to make other arrangements. I gave them a fair, written timeline to move longer than I had to because Danny asked me to and because I wasn't interested in being cruel, only in being done. Gerald is dealing with a bar complaint now. Carol says it does not look good for him, and that a man who put not in the family's interest in writing about hiding a beneficiary's inheritance should perhaps have chosen a different profession. Brooke's business collapsed when the collateral vanished. The way a thing collapses when it was built on something that was never yours. That one she did entirely to herself. And Danny took the spare room and then a real arrangement, a fair rent, his own space in the house. He's the only family I kept, and keeping him cost me nothing because he was the only one who'd ever offered me anything. We have dinner there sometimes now, at the long table in the room with the candles. And there is finally room. I learned something at that table that I wish I'd known at 6 and at 16, and every birthday they told me not to expect too much. The people who say there's no room for you are almost always standing in a space that was yours all along. And dignity is not a thing you argue for, or beg for, or earn by being small enough to tolerate. It is a thing you quietly take back in the light, and writing with your mother's name freshly painted on the gate. She lifted my chair to prove I didn't belong, and she handed me the one truth that proved I always had. The chair against the wall, the cedar box, the envelope on his plate. If someone has ever moved your seat to make you smaller, hear me. Go find your paperwork, find your worth, and put your own chair back at your own table. Comment if you'd have walked out without a word, too. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Revenge Range. The quiet ones always have the last word.